actually, when Greg called me and asked if I'd moderate this, I was thinking, okay, last mile, and I'll tell you, kind of give you guys just a brief background. And I also like to just point out that both myself and the panelists, we have wisely decided to skip the long, voluminous biography reads. We all have LinkedIn profiles. You can find out all about us. But if everyone can just introduce yourself briefly to explain some relevance. And for myself, besides being the academic director at NYU Schack, which I have to, of course, thank Richard Carr, the MBA of New York. They've given scholarships to several NYU students, as well as their mentorship program. They've really been one of the premier sponsors for an industry organization for our students. So we can't thank you enough. Those of you who are members, contributors, again, can't thank you enough. So that, obviously, professor life is one side of it. The other side of it is also my consulting life with a company called Lakemond Group. And one of the projects I've worked on for now quite a while has been with the NAOP Foundation. As you know, NAOP, the national organization, used to be the National Association of Industrial Office Properties, but they wanted to diversify, so now NAOP is just a word, doesn't really mean anything. But guess what? It's still mostly office industrial people. And one of the projects I've worked on has actually been an industrial forecasting project on the national strategy. You can go find this up on the NAOP website. It's freely open. And we launched this in 2011. And it was interesting then, we were looking at a lot of ISM, Institute of Select Manufacturing, right, for things, how can we predict industrial demand? And an interesting thing happened in doing this project years over years. When we got to about 2014, suddenly our forecast, well, let's call the performance of it and actually predicting quarterly net absorption, got substantially better. And our forecasting error went down. And you're wondering, well, do we just get smarter? Do we just find some new technique? Do we suddenly reinvent some new statistical method? No. What happened was industrial began to perform more like the economy. We would use things like GDP, interest rates, jobs, which follow the broad economy. So why did industrial do that? Well, that would correlate pretty directly with companies like Amazon and other large e-commerce groups decided that they needed to start leasing million square feet here, there, and everywhere to deliver products and goods faster. And that's really when this whole last mile thing began. And that's sort of I got to kind of watch the history of this, is where we saw where distribution kind of became more local, became more topical, and now here we are in New York, where, and obviously, as we all know, traffic flows, they freed us in New York are better than any other city. So now we have all these great infrastructure things. All that challenge is correct. How are we going to tackle that? So my first question, if you want to just give a quick introduction for yourself and perhaps an interesting tidbit as you feel, Beth, but I'd like to start with, tell us about a project that you're doing right now that you think is really interesting and how it sort of adds to the inventory of last mile space for the Manhattan region. We'll start with Andrew and go down the list.
So the biggest project that we have right now is 2505 Bruckner. It's 20 acres. It's 1 million square foot, multi-story industrial.
You want to talk to the mic?
Multi-story. Hello? 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 It's a 1 million square feet, multi-story industrial development. When I say multi-story, it's really multi-story with direct loading on the second floor. Obviously, there are industrial buildings in Queens and the Bronx and Brooklyn where you have multi-story industrial, but there's no direct loading. So that's the unique factor of it. We believe that the reason why you need to have direct loading is to have access for vans and 53-footers so that the inbound trucks can have direct access to the second floor, and then the outbound vans can have direct access to the second floor so that they can more speedily receive the goods and products and then also deliver them in a time where the delivery time frames are shrinking. Amazon just announced that they're investing $800 million to basically deliver one-day service to all their Prime members. So,
yeah, just to kind of add on to that. So Seagis is, I think, interesting perspective from this panel. Now we own 55 buildings in New York City, warehouses, existing single-story warehouses. We also do a lot of development in New Jersey and South Florida, where we do development and also buy value-add buildings. Not to give you a full discourse on the history of this stuff, but really in 2012, that's really when in New Jersey we saw a lot of these e-commerce companies take down significant amounts of large Class A new construction space. And that was a steroid injection for the market that we've never seen probably in 100 years for industrial real estate. And over the last 7 years, Amazon's taken or has spoken for 12 million square feet. And this is in a market where, high barriers to entry, and some of you guys lend or have been involved with, projects in New York City or New Jersey, and it's not easy to get entitlements and work through projects. So that's obviously had a domino effect to the market. That's also impacted Class B space, existing space, Class C space, and well-located space. So we've seen this sort of impact. We just finished the completion of a 900,000 square foot brand new building for Amazon in New Jersey, and we're seeing some of the things that Andrew's talking about in terms of expansion and getting closer to the population with an expansion plan in New York City. The last thing I'll just want to add, I'll pass it on to Jeff, is it's not just Amazon, right? So there's a lot of competitors. Obviously, Amazon is the one that gets a lot of the press, everyone talks about, but they have a lot of competitors, and it's also kind of changing the paradigm of retailers who are really thinking about, hey, how are we more effective? Because our business, high level with retailers are just so highly leveraged if you look at them, that they need to figure out how to be more efficient in getting things to the consumer. So you see a smaller footprint for their actual retail space where they're paying, the 17 corridors in New York City, they're paying, anywhere from $200 to $300 per square foot. And they're supplementing that with larger warehouses, which, again, plans that they are considering. So we're talking about Amazon, Jet.com, a lot of that gets, coverage with the last mile, but this thing also has the ability to be a lot more than that.
Thanks, Omar. So I have the privilege of being in the industrial real estate business for decades. I'll just leave that there. I'm one of those older guys. And I've watched the evolution of industrial from what Josh mentioned, that historically you always tracked the growth of the industrial market, the health of the industrial market based on GDP, manufacturing, processing of goods. There's been a huge paradigm shift, as we all know, we all hear. I left my prior firm and joined the folks at Bridge Development simply because their focus was, we want to be in supply-constrained markets, meaning Chicago, New Jersey, LA, Miami, and Seattle, places where there's no available land, but there's population densities that are going to need goods. And we referred to it back in when we had the discussions in 13 as infill. And first of all, I knew there wasn't a whole lot of green land left in New Jersey to build on, so I was like, I'm going to keep this career going, I better figure something out. And all of a sudden, I looked at it and said, okay, it's going to have issues, it's going to have demolition requirements, it's going to have geotechnical requirements because these old factory sites on the rivers, they don't support the new buildings, and you're going to have a ton of environmental problems to contend with. Is the capital, and do you have the mental capacity to deal with this? They said, we do. I said, let's go. So we opened the office and just came out of the chute hot. So at this moment in time, we're actually operating on both sides of the river. We're continuing to focus in the northern New Jersey marketplace, the historical market along 95, predominantly exit 10 and north if you're familiar with the Turnpike area. We still refer to those as infill last mile because they're still serving the greater metropolitan area. But we had the opportunity to get involved in a project in Brooklyn, Sunset Industrial Park, that we closed on in January of this year, where similar to what Andrew's doing, we're going to be doing multi-story. Because of the site layout, we have a little more flexibility. We're actually going to be building 4 stories with 4 stories of truck access on a cross-dock plant. We can explain more about that, what it means later. But it's really, it's all about the last mile and goods. And I just want to anecdotally say one thing which drove it home to me the other day. I was down at a meeting on Houston and First the other day, and I'm walking across the street. Sprinter van pulls up, stops at the light, guy gets out, opens the door, he's throwing Amazon boxes on the sidewalk. From out of nowhere, a dozen guys on bicycles showed up, picked up the boxes, and left. That's last mile.
So I think Jeff and Omar did a great job of getting everybody up to speed on state of industrial to state of last mile, where we currently stand. So I'll just kind of hit on what we're doing in the market. I'm with Sitex Group. All we do is focus on New Jersey. in New York City. We buy existing buildings, we develop. In New York City specifically, we kind of run the gamut in terms of sizes. So we bought a portfolio of several 100,000 feet in Brooklyn that we thought could service maybe a large single user, i.e. UPS, who ended up taking the site. And then we kind of go all the way down to the 30 or 40,000 square foot one-off building in Long Island City, which we also just leased to another tenant. But we run the gamut, everything from an acre to 10 acres to 20 acres, everything in between. So that's where we're at.
Right. So it's interesting. You guys all have, and that's probably why if you can figure out why everybody who is on this panel, they all have active projects here in the metro region. I'm kind of curious because obviously this is, I think people supply constrained. That's probably the nicest way to put it, right? New York is an interesting market to do development and to do work in. What's specifically for these last mile type of facilities, especially when you're trying to go multi-story? What's the largest challenge? Is it zoning? Is it height restrictions? Is it just finding big enough available land that has access to requisite roadways? What are the biggest challenges that you have found to actually making a project go? And we'll start with Zach and bring it back the other way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'll let Andrew and Jeff really dive in because they're actually working on these projects, but I think the subsurface is a major consideration, given that you've got massive floor loads on multiple levels. You gotta create the proper foundation system. Other than that, I mean, I think you're dealing with zoning, you're dealing with everything in New York City. But I'll turn it over to Jeff and Andrew. They're working on these projects live.
Sure. I'm chuckling because I'm reliving my experience getting internal approval for Brooklyn right now. It's funny. My capital partner is Texas Teachers Retirement System, right? Very significant player in the country, great people to work with. They're based out of Austin and Dallas. They like everything kind of neatly laid out. That doesn't fit New York really well, right? We all know that. That's why we're all here. The first thing we had to come to grips with, and okay, we're going to contract. You have 30 days DD. You're putting up 10% hard, and you close 30 days later. No approval contingency. And they couldn't wrap their head around that at all. Because normally I have 90 days DD, not so much anymore. I used to. Now it's 60. And you have subject to approvals maybe 270 days if you can do it in the Jersey side. And it's it's painful and slow, but it's predictable, but the risk isn't there. All of a sudden, the price on that property was no secret. It was 15 acres, $255 million. But they had 600,000 foot of existing cash flowing properties. They were like in shock when we brought it in, so I went out and found an LP partner who wanted to do the deal, and then of course it's like, when you're dating your sister's girlfriend or something like that, all of a sudden they keep running back and say, well, wait a minute, maybe this is a really nice project. So they decided to go all in with us. But that was really our first particular hurdle. But learning, coming from Jersey over to here for us, we were fortunate to partner with somebody that's been very active and operating in the city of New York for many years. Saved me maybe 3 to 5 years on a learning curve of how you actually navigate the city. Because yes, it's as of right, you have all these things, but there's more nits and nuances. Just like if I tried to bring him to New Jersey, he wouldn't get it either. So it's all the local regulations and things that you really need someone to help guide you through.
Yeah, so I'll chime in here with a couple of thoughts. I thought Zach and Jeff did a great job just giving some background on it, so I won't cover those things. What's interesting with the actual tenants who are looking at some of these spaces, especially for last mile distribution, is, and Jeff touched upon this a little bit earlier, it's goods in, goods out. And that's a scientific equation. That's a mathematical equation for a lot of these companies. This is not like, hey, let me plug this into Google Maps and it's the crow flies, it's 1.8 miles to get to the Lower East Side. These are complicated mathematical algorithms that a lot of these companies run and kind of figure out where they want to be from a location perspective. But also when they're evaluating space, it has to work efficiently. You have to get goods in, you have to get goods out. So 2 forms of ingress, egress, having some parking, having functional buildings in New York City, not very easy to find, not very easy to do. And I think, in terms of what, multi-story stuff, there are not that many big sites in New York City where you can do this stuff. So I think that's an important aspect of it. The other thing is, where are the consumers? I think that's driving a lot of this. And last thing I would want to touch upon is, and both Zach and Jeff talked about this a bit, New York City is not perfect. So you're not going to find that perfect site. And I think a lot of the questions that people have is how can that functionality work in terms of delivering the project, delivering goods in a very timely fashion. And as Andrew mentioned, Amazon's up that bar now, right? With Prime being 1 day, that's a huge, huge thing. And, other guys are really going to be scrambling to try to compete.
So in terms of the challenges, I think that supply constraint is a serious understatement with respect to industrial. So I've been investing in New York for a pretty long time, pretty much a native, grew up here since I was 2 years old, and always knew that I was supply constrained. I did a lot of resi back in my former life, and we always said it was supply constrained, but the fact of the matter is someone can assemble a site, put together some air rights, and then build a 50-story building, relatively, it's not easy, but can be done. And obviously you can see by the condo supply glut, obviously can be done, right? So what you won't see right now is an industrial supply glut. And here's the reason why. One is the industrial for these last mile companies, what they're gonna want is to be super close to the city. So if you look at the zoning map for New York City, the industrial, there's limited amount of zoning that's actually close to the city. Now there's industrial zoning like further up in the Bronx, out in JFK, etc. But if you take a look at the specific zoning that's close to the city for industrial, very limited. On top of that, a lot of that industrial that's closer to the city has been rezoned for gentrification. So for residential, basically, residential and commercial. So that supply has gone down over the last 10 years. Now, on top of that, the owners of this, it's not like they're owner-operators. So their highest and best use of the land is to basically own the land and then operate on that land. If they were to sell that land, then they would have to go buy another piece of land. That doesn't work for them, essentially, because why would they sell their land and then pay up for another piece of land when they have a perfectly good piece of land? So you're not seeing multiple listings for industrial properties that you can go buy, because in order to shake one loose, you have to convince an owner to sell his business, and that's a big hurdle. On top of that, there are very few large sites. In order to do multi-story, you probably need a minimum of 4 acres, essentially. There's just a lot of circulation that you need, etc. So you'd have maybe a minimum of 4 acres. And if you take all those factors that I just said, in terms of available sites, not owner-operated, close to the city, more than 4 acres, and then on top of that, not irregular, because a lot of these industrial sites are irregular, also dealable environmental, I mean, you're down to you can count them on your hand. So that's the biggest barrier that's going on right now in terms of availability. So
sounds like you guys are ready to be playing in the space. So.
We just found the 1 or 2 sites. That's it.
Well, so sometimes it's all you need. So it's funny. There's been a lot of discussions about what it means for Amazon to go to this 1-day pledge. So I always consider myself kind of a second generation New Yorker. I was born in Miami. My dad's from New York. Born in Brooklyn. Grew up in Forest Hills, actually out in Queens, and visiting, and then I got 2 years ago NYU headhunter called, and that's kind of how I got up here. And there's always interesting trade-offs when you move from a place, especially like Florida. I was in Orlando, and one of the trade-offs I didn't realize was I was giving up Amazon's not only just 1 day, but also even same-day delivery service, because that was one of the sort of test markets for that product. So now that they're kind of rolling it out, I'm like, if you can get one to Westchester County as fast as possible, I would really appreciate that. Just minor personal request, but it's going to have some interesting ramifications. So I can give you some history about what happens when Amazon does this. I mean, for those of you who are not Prime subscribers, you will want to become one, especially if they're not going to raise the price, which I think they'll probably raise the price. But the ability, it doesn't just impact Amazon, right? That all of a sudden, the retail decision, the decision for what you're going to likely go there, it changes a lot more when you suddenly when you short that down. So to make that a reality in New York, this is a big question that I've kind of wondered is, to really, if we're really going to do true last mile, and we're really going to try to achieve one day, if not even some point same day on certain product delivery, be it for groceries, be it for all kinds of soft goods or other things like that, are we going to have to find ways to put distribution facilities into the island of Manhattan? Are we going to have to find a way to co-locate really close to those population centers? Or are we going to have BART? How are we going to solve this? How do we logistically manage that we don't have the road capacity? Well, how do you, and I'm going to let Fielder's choice go, who wants to take this first.
I can tell you we're looking in Manhattan every day. The building that you're designing in Manhattan or that you're buying is totally different than even the buildings in the boroughs, and obviously vastly different from what you're building in New Jersey. It's most likely an old parking garage or a loft building that's got some freight elevator access. It's what I call perfectly imperfect. It's the ability to have a van back up directly into a freight elevator right off of 41st Street and load right into the elevator, go up the floor, and break down the goods and come back down the other side on the other elevator. So we're looking every day. It's going to be a hard-fought battle, I think, to get the market to buy off on that.
Is it needed? That's my question. Will tenants pay for it?
I think it's not proven yet. It's something that doesn't currently exist outside of FedEx and UPS. We believe that there will be a tenant for it.
You know, when we first started to focus on the boroughs and the last mile or Uber last mile, whatever you want to call it, my initial reaction was, well, it has to work in New York because there's population density. So then I started researching Europe, Asia, kind of trying to understand what do they have, because we'd all heard multi-story in those places before, and got involved with a couple of people who have been researching it for a while, and my eyes were really wide open. At one point I saw a building that Goodman owns, I believe it's in Hong Kong. Now this will be extreme, we're not doing this, so full disclosure, 24 stories, right at the port. The small box trucks, whatever. And what I came to realize is that while the population density is obviously key, where these last mile multi-story buildings are really going to be effective is where you have extreme congestion, right, to your point earlier, because it's the inability to actually move around in those metropolitan marketplaces. So started looking at that, and then looked at Alibaba, looked at Jet.com over in Europe. The combination of those two make Amazon look small about the population amount of e-commerce. I think between the two of them, they're handling about 75% of the e-commerce business in those nations. And they've gone almost science fiction with automated locker trucks that show up in given neighborhoods, and you go, has face recognition, the doors open, you pull your goods out. I mean, they are so far ahead of us. I'm spending a lot of time looking at that model. How does that all play here in the boroughs or in New York? I don't know. But our initial foray into this marketplace was based on, I know New Jersey can serve Midtown, can serve, look, the five hot spots are Jersey City, Hoboken, Midtown Manhattan, Long Island City, and Williamsburg, right? Those are the key markets that everybody's looking at from retailers. We know on the Jersey side you can only get so far across Manhattan, then you get stuck. So we went to the other side and say, can we get in that Brooklyn market and go up and down and try to serve those other markets from the other side? And that was our initial approach.
Yeah, just the Manhattan question is pretty interesting, and like Jeff, we spent a lot of time with a group out in Asia, just kind of studying the multi-story warehouses. Pretty fascinating. I mean, they were like, "Oh, we've been doing this since 1990," and it's been around a long time. So there's a lot of comfort and population density, as Jeff sort of mentioned. When you talk about an 8 million plus population, 2.8 million people in Brooklyn. It's pretty fascinating to see that, and I think the Manhattan stuff, to Zach's point, is pretty interesting. And it's crazy to think this for people who've been doing industrial a long time. Could you imagine a mixed-use building with industrial on the ground floor and residential on the top or office on the top? And these are things that if you mentioned this like 10 years ago, they would take you out back and take you to Bellevue. But I mean, it's a bad, that's where we're at. But the pricing, to what Andrew talked about, I mean, Manhattan real estate is so valuable, and even for a lot of these sort of industrial players. Maybe there's a way that they can cohabitate with someone, but to buy something and not have some sort of mixed-use sort of option, it would be very, very challenging. The other point I want to make is just when you look at sort of the data, the population growth within the city, I mean, obviously, median household income, disposable income, population density in Manhattan is proven, but the cranes are really in Brooklyn, they're in Queens, they're in the Bronx. More projects, are being announced. Brookfield has a big project in the South Bronx, and Domain's going there. Recently, they announced, a project there as well. So you're seeing this huge expansion throughout the boroughs. So there are going to be various abilities to play. It's really going to come down to retailers and the last mile tenants, and where they want to be and how efficiently, the model that Zach was talking about for a final sort facility. Does that work? Is it more efficient to have that here locally, or can they operate from Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx?
So on the Manhattan side, there's actually a couple of retailers and a 3PL that's actually using a Manhattan facility. Actually, Amazon uses a Manhattan facility right now to sort and then distribute. I think Macy's does as well. They bring in products from Jersey and then they sort and then they do their last mile from Manhattan. XPO Logistics, largest logistics company in the world, same thing. They deliver product from their Jersey warehouses, wherever it is, where their clients are. They bring it here, they sort. They have an independent carrier operation or employees that basically do the last mile. Now, that's for, obviously either probably more for same-day delivery. So e-commerce is only 10% of retail right now. Obviously, that's going to grow up. Some people say by 2025 or the next 5 to 6 years, it's going to be 30%. The same-day delivery portion of that e-commerce is a fraction of that 10%. So what happens when that exponentially grows? Those Manhattan facilities are not going to be, they're Band-Aids right now. They're not going to be sufficient to do it. So either you need more Manhattan facilities. The problem with that is Manhattan, as Omer said, Manhattan real estate is really expensive. Is industrial going to be the highest and best use, right? Because Manhattan real estate, it all reverts to the highest and best use, because why wouldn't you do the highest and best use if you're buying a piece of property? So don't know if industrial is going to be the highest and best use, and how many, maybe not just the ground floor, second floor, third floor. You're going to need, as the volume increases, you're going to need more loading bays, right? So for more vans, and sorting is going to take longer. I mean, so the real question is, how much space there is going to be. I mean, that's the true supply constraint. Maybe it's working now for the current status of same-day delivery. I can't see it happening if you see e-com go from 10 to 30%, and then same-day delivery exponentially increasing from there. So, that's how we kind of view Manhattan. In terms of last mile delivery, it all goes to delivery costs. So, I mean, everyone knows this, pretty common knowledge, at least in the last mile space. Real estate costs only really 5% of the entire supply chain cost. So if you increase real estate costs from Jersey to here and you double or triple that, but you can decrease your logistics costs by 50%, then you're in the money. So I'll just give you a real quick example. So if you have a warehouse in Tennessee and you had to do FedEx next day delivery on their 60% off rack rate because they have a high volume, that's $24 a package, basically. So if instead of, because that's air cargo, so FedEx picks it up at Tennessee, then they bring it to their sorting center, then it goes to basically, their airport, then it goes to another sorting center, then it gets on a truck, and then it gets delivered, okay? So instead, that warehouse gets picked up, goes by truck, which will end up being automated, so will end up getting cheaper, and electric, so it'll end up getting cheaper. So then picks it up by truck, delivers it overnight, to a warehouse here in the city, in Bronx, Brooklyn, wherever, and then you have local carriers deliver from there. That's like $12 a package. So that's the difference. And that's including the real estate costs being more expensive here than anywhere else. So that's the huge number. And then multiply $12 by how many millions of packages. Like our facility can accommodate 12 million packages probably. His 4-story is more, 24 million. That's hundreds of millions of dollars of savings to the retailer bottom line. That's old supply chain versus new supply chain. And that's what Amazon is doing. So Amazon is, at least in the Bronx, at least in Queens, they're also transforming the existing supply chain. So they're investing in the supply chain because they know air is inefficient in order to do this for next day. If you have the product closer to the consumer, you never have to use air. And you can just do daily replenishment to the warehouse. So why would you ever use air? So that's our value proposition. That's why we believe it.
That's a great point. Actually reminds me, I was working.
Yeah, it was interesting, to say the least. For a couple of concepts. We were fortunate, as I mentioned earlier, that we have about 600,000 foot of existing buildings. And it's fortunate, it's unfortunate, because then you have to deal with lease terminations, exits, and all that other stuff on top of that, right, which is a little unpredictable. However, that gave us the ability to, monetize the ongoing cash flow, right? So we went through that. And because this is a work in progress, in a short window, you've got to take the loan down. We did take a loan down at acquisition. We were able to do that. So under $255 million, we took down about $203 million. Just about LIBOR at 395 is exactly where it came in at there. And it's a short-term 2-year loan because our timing and schedule is that, we think it's going to take about a year to get all the permits and approvals through the city of New York to get ready to build, and it's going to take 12 to 24 months to build. So, we'll be going to the market afterwards to take a construction loan, but, we're already anticipating that one of the challenges, because we even hear from capital investors, and Andrew, I imagine you're hearing the same thing, it's a great story, multi-story, but nobody's really done it yet. There's a project out in Seattle. Great project. It was a good experiment for Prologis. They will admit that. I was just with those guys last week. We shared some information. It's going to prove out for them. It's going to work out really, really well. But, in the aggressive dollars that we're dealing with in the city of New York, is it really going to work? Who's going to want to take that leap of faith with us to go on the construction loan, right? So that's one of the challenges. But I do have kind of a funny story. As I mentioned, Texas Teachers is our capital. They're both on the GP and the LP side in many of our deals. So we go out to the market, and if you're looking for a $203 million loan, not a lot of players in that market, right? So your traditional bank loans like you do on the other side of the river, those players are out. So, we're talking to funds in the city about who it is, and we're down to the last three. I'm not going to mention who's who or whatever. So we come down to the deal. We go, and they're like, well, trust us on this, we'll convert it later. I'm like, trust you on that? That's a little bit out there for me to trust. So we write it up, and it's done, it's in. And pardon my vernacular, the CEO's like, well, did you really think we were going to screw you? And I'm like, yeah, this is New York, right? I mean, sure I did. And then he says, you do realize that Texas Teachers is 2/3 of my capital, right? And then I went back and followed up with the other two funds. They're 50% of each. And my investors with Texas on my side didn't even know it. So I realized how small this world really was at that moment in time.
Yeah, I've got kind of a similar story, but it dates back to 2017, just to kind of show you how hot the market is for industrial. And again, this is 2 years ago, but back when we bought our portfolio in Brooklyn, and we were pricing some high octane leverage here. We were doing 85 or 90% is what we were kind of targeting, and we had Blackstone, KKR, TPG, and Loan Corp on the site all on the same day, all term sheets at the end of the day. We ended up going with Loan Corp, and that pricing was LIBOR plus 450, and that was in 2017. And that's for 85 or 90% leverage on $100 million. So people are hot and heavy for it.
Yeah, and it's interesting to kind of see working in an established market like Jersey and then kind of coming to New York. People understand the Jersey market's well defined. Just to give you an example, and I'll talk a little bit. They've kind of covered on the construction loan and also the equity raises. But on the perm side, it's kind of interesting. So we were bringing that Amazon building that we finished construction on. There's a line of 22 people who are sort of in play on that, from life companies, debt funds, the whole gamut is sort of mixed in there. You come over to New York, and we have Class B buildings ranging from 40, even smaller, but going up to about 100,000 square feet, and we have 55 buildings. So we typically will, portfolio them up and then kind of put perm on them. That sample size from 20 goes down to about 6 or so that will be actively playing on, urban industrial Class B stuff. And I always wondered this, but not very, very similar to developers. Not everyone understands the boroughs. A lot of the stuff that Andrew's talking about. I mean, he and I both grew up in New York, so we kind of understand the dynamics. But obviously, just sort of not all lenders are sort of on board with understanding that. They'd rather put perm on a shiny new building in Indianapolis than a Class B building in Queens or Brooklyn. That's number one, is that the pool is smaller. But the guys, if you talk to the folks who are really active on that stuff, they love it. For many of the same reasons we've talked about, that supply's dwindled over the years, very few buildings, it's New York City, higher better use down the road. It's really understanding the story. In terms of spreads have certainly widened recently. Interest rates have come down. I mean, the 10-year somewhere around 250. So, we're seeing like a 140 to 180 basis point spread over that today for perm. That's generally with a LTV in the 60 to 65% range. So that's kind of typical of someone of our sponsorship, and people have been aggressive. So more people are, and just like more developers are entering the pool of investing in the boroughs, you're also seeing more lenders spending time to get comfortable with, not just the multi-story stuff, but also the existing Class B stuff. And one last point I want to make, I mean, last mile is a lot of it is, a lot of the talk is really about Amazon, Jet, and the retailers, but New York City is unique in that it's not a one-trick pony. There's a lot of existing tenant, well-run companies that have to be in New York. And that pool has been under a tremendous amount of pressure from minimum wage going up, congestion pricing we haven't really talked about, but certainly impacting even the last mile stuff. But there is a pool of tenants who have to be here. We have a ton of buildings at JFK, and that's a market to its own. Vacancy rates are below 2%, and that's not really last mile, that's airport driven. So there's a lot of different, that's the beauty of New York, is that there's so many different types of industries here, and those are also, there's certain number of, we're sort of going through a cleansing process of who really needs to be in New York versus moving out elsewhere, and it's making, some pools of tenants a lot better.
That's excellent, actually.
And just one.
Yeah, right.
Zach, are you available to do the mortgage?
Yeah, 85%, 400, yes, that's, everyone will want his card. Well, that was a good setup for, I think, for my next question. And again, this is one where you are free to name names and name terms, name prices, however you feel comfortable, or if you wish to obscure the details to protect the innocent, that is fine as well. And really, Omar just led it up to it, is the tenants. Who, when it comes to last mile, and obviously we've all heard the word Amazon, that's kind of one on top of the mind. Who are the tenants that are seeking and are most likely to lease these last mile facilities that you guys are developing? And how does it differ from the traditional tenant? And just kind of give some color to who the difference is. And if you would, share the rates they're paying or the differential that they're willing to pay to gain access to these sort of unique properties that fulfill their needs. Andrew?
I think there's a lot of theory in terms of what we just explained, and so we're early. I say we're early. The disruption's early in the supply chain that I mentioned earlier. The value proposition is clearly evident, but we're early because the infrastructure that the tenants use are the infrastructure they've used for 20 years. So in order to change that infrastructure to a different infrastructure takes time. In terms of tenants, I would say obviously you have the Amazon, you have like major e-com companies, but you have every retailer, every department store that needs to provide same-day delivery because Amazon's delivering. Pharmaceuticals, big. Groceries, big. I would say large and bulky items, although that probably needs to be less in New York City, but probably be outside in Jersey and Westchester, etc. But so apparel, I would say apparel, pharmaceuticals, grocery, those type of items that really can be delivered to the consumer really quickly. And then also, the key part is 30% of e-com is actually returns. So to the extent, just imagine where you return something and you give it to the doorman at 10 p.m. at night, and then and you go online, say you're returning it, and then your exchange is sitting there at 7 a.m. the next morning, right? that is a huge benefit, obviously, to the consumer, but to the retailer, it's a bigger, because he gets his product back immediately. Right now, what would happen is, if you were to return his product, that inventory would then go through 5, 6, 7, the longest haul back to the warehouse. So that's 7 days that the inventory is sitting in a truck and not being sold. The biggest liability on a retailer's balance sheet is inventory carry. So that's another value proposition that goes there. So anybody that has inventory that has a high percentage of returns, I mean, they need it.
Yeah, and I would add on the tenant pool, the city of New York is obviously a big tenant pool as well. They take a tremendous amount of space all across the board, but that process is longer. One thing that I was touching upon earlier is that there's just a huge dichotomy of tenant pools within the city. So you basically have the e-commerce retailers that Andrew touched upon, the grocers, all current tenants of ours that we have right now. But you also have the New York City tenants, and it's almost like there's two rates, right? Almost in a head. That e-commerce, last mile type companies, large national firms are willing to pay one rate, and New York City related companies are willing to pay another. So that is going to be pretty fascinating to kind of watch this happen. I think Andrew made a really good point. We're really early on in the stage. One thing that's happening across the country, not just in the city, is that rental rates have increased tremendously. Buying property has increased significantly. I mean, in New Jersey, to buy land over the last 2 years, it's gone up 50% each year over the last 2 years to buy stuff. So if you're, just for comparison, if you're building in New Jersey and you're buying property today and going through all the risk, I mean, you're probably solving for a 5, like return on cost, and that's 100 to 90 basis points over spreads. And hopefully you get tighter, but Jeff and I, and we've done a lot of that stuff in New Jersey. There's so many different challenges that you have to face from municipalities and timelines and price increases. So you see that ripple effect. What I really want to touch upon is that the tenants are really facing a huge increase of pricing, both in New Jersey, but also in New York City. So you're seeing resistance points, and you're seeing time to actually lease up facilities, and longer time frame in New York than other places in the country.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the last year, if I remember, the rental rate growth in New Jersey is about 20%.
Yeah.
Which has kind of almost been running that way year over year, which is a phenomenon to me, being in the business as long as I have. I think both of us. So we've seen that, and what I've also seen, though, is that we're able to fill the buildings faster at those higher rates simply because folks are coming from New York. Because if I can put up a building in Jersey, so let's say the Meadowlands hypothetically, at $13, $15 triple net, my Brooklyn project started at 30. Right? So pretty simply, you're saving 50% of your rent dollars on the other side of the river, right? Not for everybody. As far as, who do we really see? I'll be honest, talking about e-commerce and all these big names, it's sexy, it's all this kind of stuff. We're taking the mindset that we want to design a building that is functional for usage down to 40,000 square feet. And we're going to have, I believe, really do believe, we're going to be incorporating a lot of that existing tenant base that you had mentioned as well. We've had conversations with Amazon, right? Because we both have the pleasure, I think is the word, to sign a deal with those guys. It's the longest lease negotiation of my life. But we got through it. We got through it. We survived it. So obvious question is, hey, we've got this property. What do you think about it? And the comment was, we will be there. Okay, and they're taking some short-term space even right now to fill the needs. I said, well, what do you think? And they said, give us about a year. We'll line up with you because the systems we're going to use will probably be Gen 17. Like, what does that mean? He says, we're on Gen 10 right now. He says, we're going to incorporate the European Asia model back into here. So we're laying the building out, designing for ultimate flexibility. I don't think it's going to be big users. I got a hunch it's going to be a lot of smaller users in that 50, 100,000 foot range or so. But designing the building so we can accommodate them and accommodate the local business opportunities as well.
Yeah, I think Omar nailed it, right? There's definitely a tale of two cities when it comes to the tenants in New York looking for space in the boroughs. And combined with kind of what Jeff just said, the release valve for New York City tenants has always been New Jersey because it's always been about 50% of the rent price. So when we're looking at buying, and again, this is all for existing buildings. I don't really have much knowledge on new development in New York because none of it exists until these guys build it. But for existing buildings, we're underwriting based on that, 95% of the tenant base, which is that New York local contractor, the electrical contractor, the New York Asian food delivery guy. Those guys can only pay 18 or 19 bucks triple net. It's really the bigger guys, the UPSs, FedExes, Amazons, Fresh Direct to some extent, that can pay those mid to high 20s rents. Everybody else falls kind of sub 20. So if you're going out looking for buying existing buildings, you better be underwriting based on that kind of sub 20 rent.
Yeah, I just want to add one point to that. Zach makes a great point. The industrial market's not even on a triple net basis historically in the city. It's more industrial growth and modified growth structure. So we've seen that change in certain locations where it's coming to a triple net or a double net scenario. But what's interesting is, there's a lot of resistance, and we, similar to Zach, we kind of underwrite for that $18 to $19 tenant that can kind of utilize the space, that typical New York tenant.
It's good. I'll say from looking at the national statistics, it's not just a New York trend. The vacancy rate nationwide has basically fallen in half from sort of the height of the post-recession 2010 type period into where it is now, probably down to nationally in the 7s. And as we've seen that when it kind of approached sort of a minimum, right, we began to notice that the chart, or I charted this a few weeks ago for a presentation, just kind of, it looks like there's a steady, highly sloped upward trend in industrial rents. And I think this is probably a very long-term trend that where industrial, which always sort of was kind of, cheap and boxy was kind of its moniker, is now becoming far more bespoke, and we're seeing the prices starting to reflect it. So a lot of markets are actually seeing 20, 30% growth. Now, if they were, a cheap market had like $5 rents and then they go to $6, right? It doesn't sound like a huge move, but that is a 20% move. So, because I want to leave some time for audience questions, I'm sure that I'm going to ask. The last question I'm going to ask for lightning round format, which means just kind of give me yes, no, and then maybe a sentence or two of color to it. We've talked about congestion pricing. It's been in the news. Does it affect the last mile business where you locate, yes or no, and why, yes or no, briefly? Zach, why don't you start?
Yes, because it affects everybody coming into Manhattan.
Yes, totally agree with that comment.
Is that yes in a good way, yes in a bad way, or yes how?
I think it's irrelevant because it affects everybody.
Irrelevant, that's, yeah.
It will get passed on, but yes, it will impact.
We're all going to pay for it.
Yeah, and the consumer's probably going to get it.
I think yes, but it's in a certain area. So there's a thing called buy online, ship from store, where they're instead of shipping from an industrial facility, it actually ships from the retail store. That practice of shipping from the retail store with the congestion pricing is going to be gone. So you can't do ship from store in Midtown Manhattan with congestion pricing. It'll become two owners.
Very good. So with that, we've got not a ton of time, but I'd like to sort of entertain questions from the audience.
I have a question, kind of going off, we've talked a lot about different barriers and also talking about the financing. I'm curious if you could shed some light from a political perspective, because you're changing some of the zoning and use, and we're having such a housing crisis, especially with affordable housing. Have you received pushback from the city? Are they retaining this? And also, OMER, you mentioned about mixed use in some of the Asian countries. Have you thought anything about partnership with affordable housing and looking through that? I'm just curious what the market and what's going on with that.
I'll start. I think we're buying everything within M zones, so our use is typically as of right. That said, with the increase in truck traffic that's inevitable, given all these new developments and given all these new building buys and new tenants coming into the market, it'll be interesting to see what the city does to, if anything, to try to curtail some of it.
Yeah, so just to answer the first part of your question, we've seen generally a lot of support just from the standpoint that there's a huge job creation mechanism, and it's keeping jobs in New York City, which is really important for the second part of your question as well. So as it relates to affordable housing, that's a huge issue. Obviously, we saw that rear its head on some pretty big national issues earlier this year. It's a big problem. It's not going away. We thought about it in terms of incorporating it with a sort of a mixed-use industrial facility. I think everything's on the table, but I think the true issue is just going to be the cost, right? It's going to be so expensive, and Andrew kind of brought this up, and it's really what's the highest and best use. So if we can, even if an industrial user could take 3 or 4 stories, I imagine the person who's going on top of that, and again, this is just very, very early stages. That will probably come later. It'd be difficult to do that. So I think the trend is really going to have to be with retailers and with residential developers and how to really incorporate that.
Yeah, I think as Zach said and Omar alluded to, and actually Andrew made a point early on in this. Really, we're all focused in those end zones that are staying intact, and the challenge, which is what Andrew referred to, is how many of those are really left, because everything else is getting rezoned out right now. So the reception in Brooklyn that we've got has been very positive because they do want to create the jobs, right? We looked at the subway lines, where they're going to walk from, and what have you. And as pretty traditional way we've grown up in the business, whether it's in Jersey or New York, we meet with the borough, the council, everybody discuss, here's what we'd like to do, can we have your feedback, trying to engage them in the process early on. And it's ironic, whether it's here or New Jersey, the same questions come up. Okay, well, how's the truck traffic going to be? What's this? We want quality of neighborhood. So for those of us who've been doing it a long time, we're used to engaging it ahead of time. We're also used to the fact that it takes 2 to 3 years to get through that whole process. But I think by the time we're all done, as much as we're talking about this, the percentage of industrial that's going to be really occurring in the boroughs is going to be pretty small compared to what was a huge industrial zoned area at one point.
Other questions?
It sounds like these facilities have traditionally been, dealing with trucks coming in, trucks coming out, whether it's, 53-footers or box trucks, and, new technology includes, truck elevators and multi-level stuff. But is in the foreseeable future, you talked about Gen 17 and what Alibaba is doing. Are there going to be other technologies that these properties are going to have to deal with? I don't see a drone port in New York, but maybe in the suburbs, or bike messengers going to come, or robot vehicles or recharging stations, or any other technology that you could see changing the game in the foreseeable future.
I'll jump in on our thinking on it right now. So we're the reason we located the site where we did is that the majority of what we call it the Port of New York, but I hate to say this, it's really the Port of New Jersey, right? It's where all the goods come in. And we looked at the access in from the port to the facility. You coming in that way over, the outer bridge, and there's Gothel's Bridge, rather, coming in that way. Those trucks will come in the evening hours, large tractor trailers, offload. We envision, but it's unproven, I think we're all thinking the same thing, there's going to be much smaller delivery ends on the outbound side. And that'll either be, Sprinter vans, Uber, Lyft. I mean, we don't know yet who that'll be. But as I mentioned before, I'm fascinated with Europe because they're probably 20 years ahead of us. And the things that I saw that were automated in arguably a more congested area just blew me away. So I think the answer is yes. I can't predict when, and I can't predict what it will be, but we know that something's going to be changing. It's an evolving evolution.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think automation is going to play a huge role, but I also think, and we're just at the beginning stages, but 3D printing is going to rear its head one way or another. Yeah.
One thing actually, as I was thinking about as you asked that question, Amazon is obviously looking at the fact that these long little packages and people are, it's actually some of the most, at the last mile sometimes is somewhat the most expensive, right? You have to give it to a person, you have to go to an individual door, and in New York that's even more fun because you have doorman signs, you have walk-ups, etc. New York, I've noticed New York has a lot of retail on ground floor pretty much everywhere, and a lot of it's on side street. Like I overlook 43rd Street where my office is, and it's not as exciting as, say, 42nd Street. I'm sure the rents reflect that. I could see a lot of the situations where you could be somewhat taking some of this older ground floor retail that's in good locations and creating kind of either the Amazon lockers or a counter system, and then, you know what, let people, and there may be some discounting or some of this, that you walk in and pick it up, show your ID, you don't have to worry about theft or doorman signatures. So I think that the one thing that I see changing, and I see the tenants thinking about this, is that, you know, if I could get my customer to, you know, in exchange for some convenience of timing, et cetera, maybe even faster delivery, to curtail my delivery costs by picking it up their darn selves, or especially on returns, just hand it there. You know, and I think I look at our retail space that we have, especially in Manhattan, and to me that seems like somewhere they're going to figure that one out, and that will obviously shift a lot of things. That's kind of an observation that I've seen. So.
Yeah, are you seeing any opportunities out there to acquire, play mostly in close-in suburban markets, but acquire obsolete office or retail properties and scrape them, or even B2C malls to convert those to industrial?
We did that in the Meadowlands. Not me specifically, but our team did that in the Meadowlands. We scraped an old office building and put up a 40,000 square foot warehouse in its place.
Yeah, we're seeing more of the office buildings, the obsolete office buildings, which, you know, were built for $300 a foot back in the day, and this is late 80s, 90s, come down in New Jersey and have them replaced with industrial.
It would seem like an actual.
Yeah, so you're seeing a lot of that happen. The suburban office obviously has been hit pretty hard. The other interesting thing that we've looked at, and in the city, you know, in Nuanez, DoubleTree took down an old Pathmark site, which great site, great location, and who knows what they ended up doing with it. They ended up leasing a lot of it, but, you know, the thought was like that could be an industrial play. You got tremendous parking, you got an old building that you can kind of retrofit. So definitely in play. It's just few opportunities to kind of do that over here.
Yeah, we actually have 2 projects in the Meadowlands right now, 4-story office buildings. We're tearing down, putting up 100,000 feet on each site.
I've seen in Florida some either conversion or demolition of like sort of suburban shopping centers, kind of your like old anchors that have closed down, where they're putting sometimes self-storage or otherwise sort of converting it into some kind of like sawmill distribution facility. So where you have, you know, again, get outside of the New York metro where you get the land price falls, and you have, you know, 10, 20 acre shopping centers that are falling in vacant, you know, rising in vacancy with no tenants in sight. I've seen that conversion occur.
Are most of the tenants that you're dealing with 24-hour operation, 24/7?
Most of ours want to make sure that they have that ability, just so that I think their increased throughput of the facilities is anticipated on multiple shifts. But traditionally, they'll come in with 1, possibly 2, but they want the ability to go around the clock 7 days a week.
If they are 24, does that create a challenge when you start moving into areas that are more residential, so to speak? Where
Yes.
you're looking for sites and things like that.
Yeah, it's impossible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I was involved many years ago in a project like this, an early project for Amazon, and one of the things we found, we weren't exactly sure that the 24-hour operation was permitted by most of our zoning code here in the city of New York. We have warehousing, we have distribution, but 24 hours didn't neatly fit into that. 5, 6 years ago when we looked at it, it may have changed, but it became a challenge for that project.
You know, we've seen a lot of that before. Historically, there are premium costs we have to incur to sort of solve that issue. I can tell you on other projects, we've put up sound walls. In some instances, we put a bunch of evergreens up, which we made the mistake of putting them up November 15th, and behind it, there were like $3 million houses in the back, and half the trees were gone right before Christmas time. So we learned a really valuable lesson of never planting evergreen trees right before Christmas time. So
You get a discount on a Christmas tree.
No, but when you're lending, tell your guys that. But we've had to solve for that. But you bring a great point. We've dealt with truck traffic before and also the noise, but there's really not there are ways that we can quell it to some extent, but there's no perfect answer there. And last thing I would say, just very quick point, is that, having young kids in New York City, they're like comfortable when there's like beeping of horns and noise a little bit. And when we go out to a place where it's like really quiet, they're like very curious. They're like, hey, what's wrong?
Thank you so much for your comments. I'm wondering how the large retailers are responding to what you're doing. I mean, we know that Amazon bought Whole Foods, which is an interesting move for them. But you have Walmart and lots of other large retailers today. How are they responding? Are you proposing things to them, or are they doing something different? What's their reaction?
They're in test phase, so Walmart has a .com and I got a Dollar Water. So they are, a lot of them are in test phase and before they actually put a lot of the investment to scale up. So.
Yeah, and I just add on to that. So the large companies, certainly that's the case, and they're testing it out. And Jet.com, they have the Sam's, Walmart owns Sam's discount club like Costco, and they're using that for distribution. So they're experimenting, as Andrew mentioned. The other retailers, I mean, you look at Nordstrom, 1/3 of their business now is online, e-commerce. And there's so much pressure because of leverage and pricing and, in the retail world. They have to solve for this. They just have to spend the time to figure it out. So all the analysis that Andrew was really talking about, these retailers are really going through this whole exercise for themselves.
Yeah, that was brought home to us in that we did a 104-acre site in Perth Amboy, just on the north side of the Outer Bridge Crossing as you come into New Jersey. American Smelting and Refining Company. That sounds sexy, doesn't it? Had 54 areas of environmental concerns. It was amazing. But we got through that, and we just knew it was about location, proximity, all things we talked about. So we laid out the building to maximize. We built a 350, a 220, and a 718,000 foot. Before the walls were finished going up, Target showed up for the 718,000 foot. They had just embarked on their new rollout of their borough stores. Traditionally they had back warehouse space in suburban stores. Can't afford to do that here. So they did a study, and ironically they found they could service the borough stores quicker out of Perth Amboy because of the road network than working within New York. They took half of the building for that purpose. I said, what do you do with the other half? They said, we're going to experiment. They're going to spend about $30, $40 million because they're focused on that e-commerce out the door right now. And if you really saw what happened last Christmas, all of a sudden you began to hear overnight, same day from Target. And I think that's a connection with either Lyft or they have another, I forget exactly what it's called, but they are extremely focused. So the retailers that are going to stay around in a big way, that have a big presence, are hyper-focused on it right now.
I'll make, it's interesting, and this is something when I get asked a lot about. I forgot how many years ago that whole death of retail apocalypse became a media headline. So let's call a professor, he'll say something about this, right? And one of the things that I kept pointing out, and I think this is kind of interesting from from an opportunity standpoint for when we talk about this, most of online retail, and especially Amazon, we talk about Amazon Prime, is pretty much an upper income and above phenomenon. Maybe it's maybe breaches half of the middle income, and millennials maybe a little bit ahead of it, but for the most part, most retail, call it the average everyday American, if you want, I don't know what the political correct term these days are for that, but they shop at Walmart, they shop at Dollar General, they have the time and the freedom, they actually enjoy going to the store. It hasn't quite penetrated through. I think that's somewhat generational, right? I mean, part of the reason why we all pay $100 for Amazon Prime and we were dying for 1-day delivery or 2-day delivery, et cetera, is that we make incomes that we can afford $100 for a Prime membership doesn't really change our lifestyles, and getting something that saves time, right? We're all very time compressed. The more and more you work, but that's not necessarily the case for at least 50% or more Americans who, in lots of parts of the country, still enjoy going to Walmart, if you can believe such a thing. If that crowd, if that whole segment, the Dollar General, the Walmart, sort of that mass, that sort of mass market, discovers online shopping, which I think they will. I think it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. A lot of stuff has to be rethought, and we're just, I mean, that's a long-term thing. I don't think it's going to happen in the next couple of years, but by the end of the next decade, that's something we really could be looking at. So I know we're kind of coming to time, so I'm going to take the final question, and then I think we will conclude to networking time, if I understand. Does anyone want to do? Charlie.
On that note, you talk about the maybe non-urban shopper that enjoys shopping. What happens if their regional mall has died and they don't necessarily have a bricks and mortar shopping opportunity? Is there, are you guys looking at repurposing regional malls in strategic locations? or is that sort of off the radar?
Yeah, no, 100%. We were chasing the Burlington Mall down at exit 5 for a long time. And that's going to get tied up now. It's going to get into industrial. 100% well located. Look, with good road access, I think the mall's a great play.
I mean, I was going to say one of the areas that actually delivery services can probably have the most immediate effect. It might be a little bit. This might. I don't know if this will surprise you or not, but grocery. There's a lot of places that have this not so nice term called the food desert. Have you ever heard this phrase? Where there's a lot of places, believe it or not, grocery stores have this. They're can be quite persnickety about what places they actually want to open up a physical store. It's really possible that when you look at sort of, especially quality of food and et cetera, that you could actually use delivery services of grocery to sort of solve a food desert crisis, right? And that leads the pathway to other goods. And to that effect, and this is, I think, why the regional mall thing is interesting comment. One of the things that Walmart is prototyping in various markets is somewhat, again, it goes back to my idea of sort of the half Z on the last mile who actually does it. They're creating basically drive-through pickup lanes at Walmart. So you would order online, they give them an amount of time, they go pick the merchandise, which can obviously be, you think about what you might buy at Walmart, it could, fill up a car. Then you drive, you get in line, and then the employees sort of usher it out to your car, and off you go. So those are the kind of things that I think when you look at mall sites, right, and you could sort of see this you could see the integration. It'll be different though. It won't. I mean, the point I want to make out of that, from my perspective, Amazon Prime is one model, and you can see they bought Whole Foods, right? And if you're actually there's lots of it. Why? I think it's largely a real estate play. But when you look at the demographics of who shops at Whole Foods, do you know it's about a 1-1 overlap for who's typically an Amazon Prime subscriber? So they're all located, and then so think about whatever that demographic joke you might make about Whole Foods. It's actually very similar to Amazon Prime subscribers. That's a smaller segment than we all realize, and yet it's caused all this disruption, all those things we're talking about. So I guess that's how I would do that. Any further on add-ons? All right. We're
taking that to the next step. With the growth of same-day delivery and more people using it in dense urban areas, taking that model, what does that do to street urban retail along Madison Avenue or even in some of the neighborhoods?
Well, I think that there's a natural rollover of the leases, and that's also why you don't see an immediate disruption, because real estate's slow. They already have existing space, right? So they're going to use it until the lease is over, and then they're not going to renew it. So that has a natural attrition over time. So you'll see over the next 5 to 8 years, as those leases roll over, what will happen a lot is they'll probably want to stay on Madison, because you need a brick and mortar presence. I realize that brick and mortar presence is actually, in e-com, the highest cost is customer acquisition cost, right? How do you distinguish your website from every other website? Well, one way you can distinguish your website or your brand is by actually having a brick and mortar presence. So it's actually, the rent is actually an advertising cost, to tell you the truth, and that everyone sees, right? So
experiential retail.
Exactly. So I see footprints getting smaller, and I see back rooms being replaced by close warehouses. So the warehouses would serve as expanded back room, because they're closer, more frequent store replenishment. You don't have to have as big as retail footprint. So that's what I see. So you'll have more vacancy, but in the prime areas, you'll be more dense.
Yeah, I think that's good. All right, I think we are, correct me if we're at time, correct? So excellent panel. Thank you so much.